356 years before the Common Era. Close your eyes and imagine the world as it was then. A world lit only by the flickering of torches and the cold light of the stars. A world vast, terrifying, and disconnected. Maps were incomplete, fading into dragons and sea monsters at the edges. To the people of this time, the earth was a place of mystery, where gods walked among men, and where the boundaries of the known world were guarded by fear and superstition. In the West, the Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, were locked in a cycle of endless squabbling. They were the beacons of philosophy, art, and democracy, yet they were tearing themselves apart from within, blind to the storm gathering in the north. To the east, stretching across the horizon like a golden colossus, lay the Persian Empire. It was the greatest superpower the earth had ever seen, a land of unimaginable wealth, governing millions of souls from the Mediterranean coast to the rugged mountains of modern-day Pakistan. Its kings called themselves the King of Kings, ruling from throne rooms that shimmered with lapis lazuli and gold. To the Greeks, Persia was an invincible monster, a permanent shadow over their freedom. No one could have predicted that the old world was about to end. No one could have foreseen that the map of humanity was about to be redrawn, not by a coalition of nations, but by the will of a single young man. He was not born in the high courts of Babylon, nor in the philosophical academies of Athens. He was born in the rough, mountainous frontier of Macedonia, a place the civilized Greeks looked down upon as a land of barbarians and goat herders. But within 20 years, this boy would force the world to its knees. This is a story that defies logic. It is a story of a military campaign that lasted over a decade, covering 22,000 miles of enemy territory. It is the story of an army that marched through snow-capped mountains, burning deserts, and monsoon-soaked jungles, never losing a single battle. But this is not just a story of maps and arrows. It is a psychological journey into the heart of ambition. It is about a young man who slept with the Iliad under his pillow, who believed with every fiber of his being that he was descended from heroes and gods. He chased a dream of a unified world, a brotherhood of mankind, yet he washed the earth in blood to achieve it. He was a paradox. He was a student of Aristotle, a lover of poetry and science, capable of immense generosity and grace. Yet, he was also a paranoid tyrant who murdered his closest friends in fits of drunken rage, a man who slaughtered entire cities that dared to defy him. Who was he really? Was he the great civilizer who opened the eyes of the West to the wonders of the East? Or was he the ultimate destroyer, a megalomaniac who sacrificed a generation of young men on the altar of his own vanity? Over the next 10 chapters, we will not simply recite dates and battle tactics. We are going to walk alongside him. We will stand in the dust of Gaugamela. We will feel the heat of the burning palace at Persepolis. We will taste the despair in the Gedrosian desert. We will witness the rise of a god and the slow, tragic fall of a man. From the blood-soaked floors of the Macedonian palace to the deathbed in Babylon, where the fate of the world hung in silence. We are about to embark on the greatest adventure in human history. The age of kings is over. The age of Alexander has begun. Chapter 1. The Lion's Cub, Blood and Philosophy. In the rugged, wind-swept heart of Pella, the capital of Macedonia, a storm was brewing. It was the summer of 356 BC. Legend says that on the night of his birth, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground. When the priests were asked why the gods had allowed such a temple to fall, they replied, because the goddess was too busy attending the birth of Alexander. To understand the man who would burn the world, one must first understand the two forces that forged him: his parents. His father, King Philip II, was a warrior king of brutal efficiency. He took a fractured, weak Macedonia and turned it into the most feared military machine in Europe. Philip was a man of scars, having lost an eye, a collarbone, and a leg in battle. He was a master of politics and the phalanx. But his mother, Olympias, was something else entirely. She was a princess of Epirus, a devotee of the mystical cults of Dionysus, who reportedly slept with snakes in her bed. She whispered into young Alexander's ear a dangerous secret. "Philip is your earthly father, but you are the son of Zeus. You are a god among mortals." Caught between the cold, hard realism of his father and the fiery, divine mysticism of his mother, Alexander grew up in a court of shadows and daggers. Macedonian politics was a blood sport. Every meal could be poisoned. Every shadow could hide an assassin. But Alexander was different. He was not just a prince, he was a prodigy. When he was just a boy, a Thessalian horse merchant brought a stallion to the court. It was a massive black beast named Bucephalus. It was wild, rearing and biting at anyone who approached. Philip, frustrated, ordered the horse taken away. But Alexander stepped forward. He had noticed something the veteran soldiers had missed. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. The boy turned the stallion toward the sun so it could no longer see the darkness moving beneath it. He spoke softly, leaped onto its back, and galloped across the field. When he returned, the court was silent. Philip, with tears in his eyes, kissed the boy and said, "My son, find thee a kingdom worthy of thyself, for Macedonia is too small for thee." Yet, Philip knew that a king needs more than just a sword. He needs a mind. He summoned the greatest intellectual of the age to a remote village called Mieza, Aristotle. For 3 years, under the shade of stone porticos, the greatest mind of the ancient world tutored the greatest conqueror. Aristotle did not just teach him logic and medicine, he gave him a vision. He taught him that the Greeks were superior and that the barbarians of the East were ripe for the taking. He gave Alexander a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by his own hand. Alexander took this book everywhere. He didn't see it as fiction. He saw it as a manual for his life. He saw himself as the new Achilles. But as Alexander grew, so did the tension with his father. Philip's shadow was long, and Alexander feared there would be no glory left for him to win. When Philip married a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, the fragile peace of the royal house shattered. At the wedding feast, a drunken brawl broke out. Insults were hurled. Philip drew his sword to kill his son, but blinded by wine, he tripped and fell. Alexander looked down at his father and laughed with cold contempt. "See there," he shouted to the guests. "The man who makes preparations to pass out of Europe into Asia, overturned in passing from one seat to another." The bond was broken. The lion's cub was no longer a child. He was a rival. But the gods, or perhaps the assassins of Macedonia, had their own plans. In 336 BC, at a grand festival in Aegae, a bodyguard's blade would find Philip's heart. The king was dead. The throne was dripping in blood. And at 20 years old, the boy who believed he was a god stepped out of the shadows. The world was about to find out exactly what Aristotle had taught him. Chapter 2. The Boy King, Assassination and Ascension. The blade that pierced Philip's heart didn't just kill a king, it shattered the fragile stability of the entire Greek world. As Philip's blood pooled on the stone floor of the theatre at Aegae, a deafening silence fell over Macedonia. In that moment, the empire was a carcass, and the vultures were already circling. Alexander was only 20 years old. To the veteran generals, he was a child playing at being a soldier. To the conquered tribes in the north, he was a weakling. And to the proud city-states of Greece, Athens and Thebes, he was a marginal brat whose authority died with his father. They were all dead wrong. Alexander didn't mourn, he moved. He knew that in Macedonia, you don't inherit a throne, you seize it or you die. Within hours, the army, led by the loyal general Antipater, proclaimed him king. But being proclaimed king was not the same as being secure. First, he had to cleanse the house. With a cold, terrifying efficiency, Alexander ordered the execution of any domestic rival who could claim the crown. Even his mother, Olympias, ensured her position by brutally disposing of Philip's other wives and their infants. The message was sent. The new king's mercy was a myth. But while the palace was being scrubbed of blood, the borders were collapsing. To the north, the wild Thracian and Illyrian tribes rose in rebellion. To the south, the Greeks were celebrating Philip's death as the dawn of freedom. Demosthenes, the great Athenian orator, mocked Alexander, calling him a boy and a fool. Alexander's response was a masterclass in lightning warfare. He didn't wait. He didn't negotiate. He marched his army north with such speed that the Thracian tribes were crushed before they could even assemble. He drove his phalanx through mountain passes that were thought to be impassable. But while he was fighting in the northern wilderness, a rumor reached Greece. Alexander is dead. He was killed in battle. Thebes and Athens erupted in joy. Thebes took up arms, surrounding the Macedonian garrison. It was a gamble for independence. Then the impossible happened. In just 14 days, Alexander marched his army 250 miles through the rugged terrain of Greece. He appeared before the gates of Thebes like a ghost rising from the grave. He gave the Thebans one chance to surrender. They refused. What followed was a slaughter that sent a shiver through the spine of the ancient world. Alexander did not just defeat Thebes, he erased it. 6,000 Thebans were put to the sword. 30,000 were sold into slavery. One of the oldest and proudest cities in Greece was razed to the ground. Its buildings turned to rubble, leaving only the house of the poet Pindar standing. A chilling reminder that Alexander valued art, but he valued obedience more. The rest of Greece fell into a deathly silence. Athens, terrified, sent ambassadors to congratulate the boy they had just mocked. Alexander was now the undisputed master of Greece. But his eyes were not on the ruins of Thebes. He looked east, across the Hellespont, toward the horizon where the sun rose over the Persian Empire. He had the army, he had the power, he had the terrifying reputation, but he had no money. The royal treasury was empty, and he was deeply in debt. He had only 70 talents of silver and 30 days of supplies. He was a king with a bankrupt kingdom and a world-class army. To survive, he had to conquer. To remain a king, he had to become an emperor. He divided his remaining lands and riches among his friends. When his general, Perdiccas, asked him, "My lord, what have you left for yourself?" Alexander looked at the sea and replied with a single word: hope. The boy king was gone. The conqueror had arrived. Chapter 3. Crossing the Hellespont. The invasion begins. In the spring of 334 BC, the world changed forever. Alexander stood on the European shore of the Hellespont, the narrow strip of water separating west from east, Europe from Asia. Behind him stood nearly 40,000 men, Macedonian phalangites with their 18-foot pikes, elite companion cavalry, and scouts from every corner of Greece. Before him lay the vast, ancient, and mysterious Persian Empire. As the boats ferried the army across, Alexander did something that revealed the core of his soul. As his ship neared the Asian shore, he stood at the prow, fully armored, and hurled a spear with all his might into the soil. As the bronze tip bit into the earth, he leaped into the surf and declared Asia won by the spear. This was not a diplomatic mission. This was a holy war. His first stop was not a military outpost, but the ruins of Troy. To Alexander, the Iliad was his map. and Achilles was his rival. He ran naked around the tomb of his legendary ancestor, traded his own armor for a sacred shield from the temple of Athena, and paid his respects to the heroes of old. He wasn't just invading a country, he was stepping into a myth. But the Persians were not ghosts, they were a reality. Darius III, the great king of Persia, didn't initially take the Macedonian boy seriously. He sent his local governors, the satraps, to deal with the nuisance. These governors gathered their forces at the river Granicus. Among the Persian advisors was a Greek mercenary named Memnon of Rhodes. He gave the Persians the only advice that could have stopped Alexander. Burn everything, destroy the crops, retreat and starve him. He has no money and no food. The Persian satraps, blinded by pride, refused. They considered it unmanly to burn their own land. They decided to stand and fight at the river's edge. When Alexander arrived at the Granicus, his veteran general Parmenion looked at the steep, slippery banks and the mass of Persian cavalry waiting on the other side. "It is too late in the day, my lord," Parmenion warned. "The water is deep, the banks are high. We should wait." Alexander's eyes flashed with the fire of a man who refused to wait for destiny. "I should be disgraced," he replied, "if after crossing the Hellespont I should fear a little stream like the Granicus." He plunged into the river. The battle was a chaotic, bloody mess of splashing water and screaming men. Alexander, wearing a helmet with 2 white plumes that made him a target for every Persian blade, was in the thick of it. At one point, a Persian noble named Spithridates swung a battle axe, shearing off part of Alexander's helmet and raising his arm for the killing blow. In that split second, the history of the world hung by a thread. Just before the axe fell, Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's officers, drove a spear through the Persian's shoulder, saving the king's life. The Macedonian phalanx pushed through. The Persian line snapped. The slaughter was absolute. Alexander had won his first major victory on Asian soil, and the road to the heart of the empire was now open. He moved south, liberating Greek cities along the coast. Some welcomed him as a god, others he had to break. In the city of Gordium, he encountered the legendary Gordian knot, a knot so complex that an oracle prophesied that whoever untied it would rule all of Asia. Alexander stood before the knot as his generals watched in silence. He didn't spend hours trying to find the ends of the rope. He didn't use patience. He drew his sword and with a single violent stroke hacked the knot in 2. It was the ultimate statement of his philosophy. Why solve a problem when you can destroy it? The news of the defeat at Granicus and the untying of the knot finally reached the ears of Darius III in the palace of Susa. The King of Kings realized this was no longer a border skirmish. He began to summon the full might of the Persian army, a force so large it was said to drink whole rivers dry. The stage was set for the first great collision of kings. The spear-won land was about to be soaked in more blood than Alexander ever imagined. Chapter 4. Duel of Kings, the Battle of Issus. The year was 333 BC. The shadow of the Macedonian spear had grown long, but the great king of Persia, Darius III, was finally coming to meet it. Darius was not just a king, he was a god on earth to his people. He moved with a court that looked like a traveling city, thousands of servants, his mother, his wife, his children, and a royal treasury of gold. He brought with him the Immortals, his elite guard of 10,000 warriors. His army was so vast that it stretched for miles across the horizon. By a strange twist of fate and missed intelligence, the two armies actually passed each other in the night, separated by a mountain range. When Alexander realized Darius was behind him, cutting off his supply lines, he didn't panic. He turned his exhausted men around and marched back toward the narrow coastal plain of Issus. Geographically, Issus was a nightmare for Darius. He had hundreds of thousands of men, but the space between the mountains and the sea was too narrow for him to use his numbers. He was cramped. Alexander, on the other hand, saw exactly what he needed: a bottleneck. As the sun rose over the Pinarus River, the two kings looked at each other across the water for the first time. On one side, the colorful, shimmering mass of the Persian Empire. On the other, the bronze, mud-stained, and disciplined lines of the Macedonians. The battle began with a roar. The Macedonian phalanx plunged into the river, but the banks were steep, and the Persian-Greek mercenaries fought like demons. The center of Alexander's line began to buckle and tear. For a moment, it looked like the invasion was over. But Alexander wasn't watching the center. He was leading the companion cavalry on the right wing. He waited for the exact moment when the Persian line stretched too thin. With a primal scream, he led a wedge of horsemen straight through the gap. He wasn't aiming for the soldiers. He was aiming for the head of the snake. He was charging directly at Darius. As the Macedonian cavalry hacked their way closer and closer, Darius's royal charioteer was killed by a spear. The horses panicked. Darius looked into the eyes of Alexander, a man covered in blood, charging like a whirlwind. In a moment of pure terror that would haunt his reputation forever, the King of Kings turned his chariot and fled the field. When the Persian army saw their god-king running, the morale of the greatest empire on earth shattered like glass. The retreat turned into a massacre. Men trampled their own comrades to escape the Macedonian blades. But the most shocking moment came after the battle. In his haste, Darius had abandoned his camp, his gold, and most importantly, his family. When Alexander entered the royal Persian tent, he found a world of luxury he had never imagined. Golden baths, incense and silk. He also found the mother, wife, and daughters of Darius trembling in fear, expecting to be violated or killed, as was the custom of war. Instead, Alexander did something that surprised the world. He treated them with the respect due to queens. He told them, "I am not at war with you. I am at war with Darius for the empire of Asia." He even referred to Darius's mother as mother for the rest of her life. It was a brilliant act of psychological warfare. He wasn't just conquering their land, he was stealing their hearts and their legitimacy. Darius sent a letter to Alexander offering a massive ransom for his family and the surrender of half his empire in exchange for peace. Alexander's general, Parmenion, looked at the offer and said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander's reply was cold and immortal. "So would I if I were Parmenion, but I am Alexander." He sent a letter back to Darius, not as an equal, but as a master. He told Darius, "From now on, when you write to me, address me as the king of all Asia. Do not write to me as an equal. If you want your land back, stand and fight. For wherever you go, I shall follow." The war was no longer about territory, it was now a hunt. Chapter 5. Son of Amun, the Siege of Tyre and Egypt. Alexander had humiliated the great king, but he was a master strategist. He knew that as long as the Persian fleet controlled the Mediterranean, his homeland was at risk. He decided to defeat the fleet on land by capturing every Persian port. This led him to the island city of Tyre, a fortress thought to be impregnable. Tyre sat half a mile out in the sea, protected by massive walls that rose directly from the waves. The Tyrians laughed from their battlements, believing no army could reach them. But they did not know the man they were dealing with. If there was no path to the city, Alexander would build one. For 7 months, his army became a construction crew. They built a massive mole, a land bridge, out into the ocean, using stones and timber from the ruins of old cities. Despite fire ships and constant bombardment from the Tyrians, the bridge crept closer every day. When the walls were finally reached, Alexander unleashed his secret weapons, massive siege towers, and torsion catapults. The city was breached. The rage of the Macedonians, fueled by months of frustration, was catastrophic. 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting, and 30,000 were sold into slavery. Alexander had moved mountains and conquered the sea. With the coast secure, he turned south toward the ancient land of the pharaohs, Egypt. The Egyptians hated their Persian masters. To them, Alexander wasn't an invader, he was a liberator. As he entered the ancient capital of Memphis, they placed the double crown of Egypt on his head and declared him pharaoh. But for Alexander, being a king and a pharaoh was not enough. He needed to know the truth of his blood. He led a small group on a perilous 500-mile journey across the blistering sands of the Sahara Desert to the Siwa oasis. There, hidden in the dunes, lay the Oracle of Amun, one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world. The journey nearly killed them. They ran out of water and were blinded by sandstorms. Legend says that 2 ravens, or perhaps 2 serpents, appeared to lead them through the shifting sands. When they finally reached the temple, Alexander entered the inner sanctum alone. What happened inside remains one of history's greatest mysteries. When he emerged, the high priest greeted him with a slip of the tongue, or perhaps a calculated divine message. Instead of calling him, "O my son, O Pi," he reportedly called him, "O Son of God, O Pi Dios." From that day on, something in Alexander changed. He was no longer just the son of Philip. He truly believed he was the son of Amun, the Greek Zeus. He had found his divine father, and with that realization, his ambition became boundless. He was no longer just a king of men, he was a god in the making. Before leaving Egypt, he walked along a strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the sea. With his own hands, using grain to mark the lines, he laid out the blueprint for a city that would become the intellectual heart of the world, Alexandria. He had the blessing of the gods. He had the crown of the pharaohs. He had a city named after himself. But far to the east, in the heart of Mesopotamia, Darius III had spent 2 years gathering the largest army in human history. The King of Kings was waiting on the plains of Gaugamela for one final apocalyptic showdown. Alexander left the Nile behind and marched toward his destiny. The world was about to witness the greatest battle ever fought. Chapter 6. The Fall of an Empire, Gaugamela and Persepolis. The year was 331 BC. The world held its breath. Darius III had learned his lesson from Issus. He would not be caught in a narrow pass again. He chose the battlefield himself, the wide, flat plains of Gaugamela near modern-day Iraq. He even ordered his soldiers to level the ground, removing every bush and stone so that his scythed chariots, monstrous machines with blades spinning from their wheels, could mow down the Macedonians like tall grass. The Persian army was a sea of humanity. Historians of the time claimed there were 1 million men. Modern estimates suggest at least 250,000. Against them, Alexander had 47,000. As the sun set before the battle, the Macedonian generals looked at the horizon. The thousands of Persian campfires looked like a galaxy of fallen stars. Parmenion came to Alexander's tent and whispered, "My lord, you must attack by night. We cannot face such a multitude in the light of day." Alexander, famously, did not look up from his map. "I will not steal my victory," he replied. That night, while the Persians stayed awake in full armor, fearing a night attack, Alexander slept so soundly that his generals had to wake him 3 times the next morning. As the battle began, the dust was so thick it turned the air into a golden fog. Darius unleashed his scythed chariots. It was a terrifying sight, but the Macedonians had been trained for this. As the chariots neared, the phalanx simply opened their ranks, creating mouse traps. The chariots passed through harmlessly and were dealt with by the rear guards. Then came the moment. Alexander spotted a gap in the Persian line created by their own cavalry charge. He formed his companion cavalry into a giant iron-tipped wedge. He didn't just charge the army, he charged the man. He rode straight for Darius. The carnage was unspeakable. Spears shattered, horses screamed, and men drowned in the dust. Darius, seeing his elite guards falling and Alexander's blood-stained face closing in again, lost his nerve. For the second time, the great king turned his chariot and fled. Gaugamela was the death blow. The Persian army collapsed. The King of Kings was now a fugitive in his own land. Alexander marched into Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a god. He entered the city in a chariot strewn with flowers, greeted by the smell of frankincense and the cheers of the people. He moved on to Susa, where he sat upon the throne of Darius, a throne so high that the short Macedonian king's feet didn't touch the floor. They had to bring a small table for him to rest his boots on. But the true end of the old world came at Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. Persepolis was a marvel of the ancient world, a forest of stone columns and golden gates. Alexander stayed there for 4 months. Then one night, during a massive drunken banquet, a Greek woman named Thais challenged Alexander. She told him that to truly avenge Greece, he should burn the palace of the man who had once burned Athens. In a moment of drunken madness, or perhaps a cold, calculated political move to show that the house of the Achaemenids was finished, Alexander grabbed a torch. His generals followed. They hurled the fire into the silken curtains. The cedar ceilings collapsed. The gold melted into the cracks of the stone. The greatest palace on earth was reduced to ash. As Alexander stood in the morning light, watching the smoke rise over the ruins of Persepolis, he realized he had done it. He had conquered the unconquerable. He was no longer just the king of Macedonia, he was the lord of Asia. But as the fires of Persepolis died down, a new fire began to burn in Alexander's mind. A fire of paranoia, a hunger for more, and a strange, growing obsession with the very Persian customs he had come to destroy. The war for territory was over, the war for his soul. Chapter 7. Into the Unknown, the Chase and Roxana. The Persian Empire was a corpse, but its ghost was still haunting the mountains of the east. Darius III was fleeing toward the edge of the world, and Alexander was obsessed with catching him. He didn't want Darius dead, he wanted him to surrender the crown personally. But the Persian nobility had lost faith in their king. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria and a kinsman of Darius, committed the ultimate betrayal. He arrested his own king and dragged him along in a golden cage. When Alexander's scouts finally closed in, Bessus panicked. He stabbed Darius and left him to bleed out in a lonely wagon on the side of a dusty road. When Alexander finally found the wagon, it was too late. The great king of Persia was dead. Legend says Alexander covered the body with his own cloak and wept. He didn't weep for a friend, but for a rival. The man he had chased for years was gone, and with him, the only other person on earth who truly knew what it felt like to be a king of kings. Alexander sent Darius's body to Persepolis to be buried with full royal honors. Then he turned his eyes toward Bessus. He wasn't just a conqueror anymore, he was an avenger. He tracked Bessus into the rugged, frozen mountains of the Hindu Kush, a place where the Greeks believed only gods and heroes had walked. The campaign became a nightmare of guerrilla warfare. This was not the open-plain Battle of Gaugamela. This was a war of shadows, of freezing winters, and of mountain fortresses built into the clouds. It took Alexander nearly 3 years to subdue the provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. In the midst of this brutal war, Alexander captured a fortress called the Sogdian Rock. Among the prisoners was a woman of extraordinary beauty, Roxana, the daughter of a local chieftain. For the first time in his life, the man who cared only for glory was struck by passion. Against the advice of his generals, who wanted him to marry a high-born Macedonian or a Persian princess, Alexander married Roxana. It was a move that signaled his shift. He was no longer a Greek king, he was becoming an Eastern monarch. But as he embraced the East, his own men began to hate him. Alexander started wearing Persian robes. He began demanding proskynesis, the Persian custom of bowing to the floor before a king. To the Greeks, this was blasphemy. You only bowed to gods, not to men. The tension boiled over during a drunken banquet in Samarkand. Clytus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, stood up and insulted the king. He shouted that Alexander was forgetting his father Philip and claiming the glory of others. In a fit of blind rage, fueled by wine and paranoia, Alexander snatched a spear from a guard and drove it through Clytus's heart. The moment Clytus fell, Alexander's rage turned to horror. He tried to kill himself with the same spear, but was stopped by his guards. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, weeping, refusing to eat. He had conquered the Persian Empire, but he was losing the war against his own temper. He eventually emerged, colder and more determined than ever. He had reached the edge of the Persian world, but his maps showed more. To the east, across the mountains, lay the legendary land of India, a place of gold, strange beasts, and the end of the great outer sea. His men wanted to go home. Alexander wanted the ocean. The hunt for Darius was over. The hunt for the edge of the world had begun. Chapter 8. The Edge of the World, India and the Mutiny. By 326 BC, Alexander's army had been away from home for 8 years. They were battle-hardened, scarred, and laden with the riches of a fallen empire. But for Alexander, the horizon was a siren song he could not ignore. He turned his gaze toward India, a land of myth where the Greeks believed the gods Dionysus and Heracles had once wandered. The entry into India was not a march, it was a bloodbath. The tribes of the Swat Valley fought for every inch of their mountain soil. At the fortress of Aornos, a peak so high that even Heracles was said to have failed to take it, Alexander's engineers built a massive bridge across a ravine to reach the walls. When the fortress fell, the world knew. No wall on earth was high enough to keep Alexander out. But his greatest challenge waited at the Hydaspes River. There stood King Porus, a giant of a man ruling a powerful kingdom. Unlike the Persians, Porus did not rely on chariots. He brought 200 war elephants, massive grey fortresses of flesh and bone that the Macedonians had never faced in such numbers. The Battle of the Hydaspes was the most brutal of Alexander's career. Under a torrential monsoon rain, amidst the mud and the thunder, the Macedonian phalanx met the elephants. The beasts trampled men into the red mud, their tusks goring through armor. But the Macedonian discipline held. They used long axes and scythes to hamstrung the elephants, turning the animals into panicked engines of destruction that trampled their own Indian ranks. Porus was defeated, but his bravery so impressed Alexander that he asked the fallen king how he wished to be treated. "Like a king," Porus replied. Alexander not only restored his lands, but expanded them, making him an ally. However, Alexander lost something irreplaceable at the Hydaspes: his horse, Bucephalus. The stallion that had carried him from the plains of Macedonia to the heart of India finally collapsed from age and wounds. Alexander wept like a child and founded a city in the horse's name, Bucephala. He pushed his men further east, toward the Ganges River. He had heard rumors of even greater empires, with thousands of elephants waiting in the interior. He wanted to see the ocean that circled the world. He wanted to conquer the edge of the map. But at the Hyphasis River, the unbreakable bond between the king and his men finally snapped. The soldiers were exhausted. Their clothes were rags, their weapons were blunted, and they had been marching under constant tropical rains for 70 days. They had heard enough of one more river and one more glory. They sat in their tents and wept. They refused to go another step. For the first time in his life, Alexander was defeated, not by an enemy, but by his own men. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, fuming, waiting for them to change their minds. But the silence from the camp was absolute. Conus, one of his most loyal generals, spoke for the army. "A noble thing, O king, is to know when to stop." Alexander finally emerged and gave the order, "We turn back." The army erupted in cheers. They thought they had won their lives back. But Alexander was a man who did not handle rejection well. He agreed to go home, but he chose the most brutal, unexplored, and deadly route possible. If they would not follow him to glory in the east, they would follow him through hell in the south. The journey home would prove more lethal than any Persian army. Chapter 9. The March of Death, the Gedrosian Desert. Alexander was a man who had never been told no. When his army forced him to turn back at the Hyphasis River, something inside him fractured. He had granted them their wish to return, but he would make them pay for it in blood and sweat. He chose a path that defied common sense, a march through the Gedrosian Desert, a wasteland so desolate that even the great Persian kings of old had lost entire armies within its shifting sands. The journey began with a brutal descent down the Indus River. Along the way, Alexander continued to fight, as if trying to exercise his frustration through violence. At the city of the Mali, he became so impatient with his soldiers' hesitation that he leaped off the battlements into the enemy city alone. He was shot through the lung with a massive arrow. For days, he hovered between life and death. His men, thinking their god-king was finally dead, fell into a panic of grief. But Alexander survived. He rose from his bed, pale and hollow, and ordered the march to continue. Then, they entered the Gedrosian Desert. It was a landscape of hell. The heat was a physical weight, crushing the breath out of the men. There was no shade, no water, and no mercy. The golden sand became a graveyard. The pack animals died first, followed by the women and children who followed the camp, and finally the soldiers themselves. Men went mad with thirst. They would find a small spring, drink until they burst, and die in the mud. At night, flash floods would occasionally roar through the dry ravines, sweeping away tents, horses, and sleeping soldiers in a cruel irony of too much water after days of none. During this march, a famous moment occurred that defined Alexander's leadership. A group of scouts found a tiny trickle of water and brought a helmet full of it to the king. Alexander was parched, his throat burning. He looked at his gasping, dying men, then took the helmet and poured the water into the sand. He refused to drink what his men could not. It was a gesture of supreme solidarity, but it did not stop the dying. By the time the remnants of the army reached the safety of Carmania, 3/4 of the people who had entered the desert were dead. Alexander had lost more men to the sun and the sand than in all his battles combined. He arrived back in the heart of his empire to find it in chaos. Governors, believing he was dead in India, had become corrupt, looting temples and raping the land. Alexander's response was a wave of executions. He was no longer the idealistic youth who had crossed the Hellespont. He was a hardened, paranoid autocrat who trusted no one but his closest friend, Hephaestion. In a desperate attempt to fuse his two worlds together, he organized the Susa weddings. He forced 80 of his top officers to marry Persian noblewomen, and he himself took 2 more Persian wives. He wanted to create a new race, a blend of East and West. But the Macedonians saw it as a betrayal of their blood. Then, the final blow to his heart fell. In the autumn of 324 BC, in the city of Ecbatana, Hephaestion, the man he loved more than any other, the man who was his other soul, fell ill and died. Alexander's grief was pathological. He cut his hair short, ordered the manes of all the horses to be shorn, and executed the physician who had failed to save his friend. He sat by the body for days, refusing to leave. He had conquered the world, but he was now utterly alone. Broken, haunted, and increasingly drinking himself into stupors, Alexander turned his horse toward Babylon. The omens were dark. Ravens were seen fighting in the sky and falling dead at his feet. The Chaldean seers warned him, "Do not enter the city from the east." Alexander ignored them. He entered the gates of the world's greatest city to plan one last, massive invasion of Arabia. But the gods were finished with him. The countdown to the end had begun. Chapter 10. The Last Days in Babylon. To the Strongest Babylon. The Golden City, the center of the world. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander returned to the city where his journey had reached its zenith. But the atmosphere was heavy with dread. The air in Babylon was thick and stagnant. Alexander was 32 years old, but he carried the weight of 1,000 years. He was haunted by the ghost of Hephaestion and restless with plans for a new invasion, this time to circumnavigate Arabia and conquer the Mediterranean. But the fire that had burned so brightly for 13 years was flickering. During a long, sweltering night of heavy drinking at a banquet hosted by his friend Medius, Alexander felt a sudden, sharp pain in his back, as if he had been struck by a spear. He collapsed. A fever took hold of him, a slow, burning fire that consumed him from the inside out. Day by day, the king withered. Rumors spread like wildfire through the streets of Babylon. Some whispered of poison, a slow-acting toxin sent by Antipater or brewed by the sons of Aristotle. Others said it was the curse of the gods, or simply the price of a life lived at the absolute limit of human endurance. As the fever climbed, Alexander lost the ability to walk, then the ability to stand. Finally, his voice, the voice that had commanded tens of thousands through the roar of battle, faded to a rasping whisper. The Macedonian soldiers, the men who had cursed him in the desert but loved him like a father, demanded to see him. They feared he was already dead. In one of the most heartbreaking scenes in history, the doors to the royal bedchamber were opened. The grizzled, battle-scarred veterans filed past his bed in a silent, weeping procession. Alexander could not speak, but he struggled to raise his head, acknowledging every single man with his eyes. It was his final review of the troops. As the end drew near, his generals gathered around him, desperate for a final command. The empire he had built had no heir. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant, but the child was not yet born. "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" they whispered. Alexander, with his final breath, gasped out 3 words that would plunge the world into a century of blood. "To the strongest." On June 11th, 323 BC, the sun set on the life of Alexander the Great. He died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, thousands of miles from the home he had left as a boy. The silence that followed his death was deafening. There was no transition of power, only a vacuum. His generals, the Diadochi, immediately began to tear the empire apart, fighting over the pieces like wolves over a carcass. His body, preserved in a vat of golden honey, was hijacked by Ptolemy and taken to Egypt, a final trophy in a game that never ended. What was his legacy? He left behind dozens of cities named Alexandria, a world where Greek culture and Eastern wisdom were forever fused. and a military record that remains the gold standard for every general from Caesar to Napoleon. He broke the barriers between civilizations and opened the veins of the world. But he also left behind a trail of ashes. He destroyed the ancient Persian order and replaced it with a chaos that lasted for generations. He was a man who reached for the stars but stepped on the necks of millions to get there. Alexander never had a chance to grow old. He never had to govern the world he had conquered, nor see his hair turn grey or his mind fade. He remained forever young, forever the conqueror, frozen in time at the edge of his glory. He had lived a short life of spectacular intensity. He had looked into the abyss of the unknown and forced it to blink. He had sought to be a god, and in the end, perhaps he succeeded. For as long as men tell stories of courage, ambition, and the pursuit of the impossible, the name of Alexander will never die. The world was once his. Now he belongs to history,